Welcome back to the report. In tonight's feature, we look at the ongoing dispute between the software company Apple and the FBI over the handling of a court order to help unlock the iPhone of the San Bernardino killer, Saeed Rizwan Farouk. But what started as a court order for access to a single iPhone has now grown into a wider debate about the rights and wrongs of digital privacy. Nathaniel Amos Sansom has this report.
The issue of data security has become a hot topic of discussion in recent weeks, after the technology giant Apple said that it would refuse the court order which insisted that it granted the Federal Bureau of Investigation access to data on an iPhone formerly belonging to Saeed Rizwan Farouk, one of the attackers involved in the San Bernardino shootings last year. Speaking in an interview with ABC, the CEO of the company laid out his objections to the court order, saying that to access the data would require engineering software, which could pose a serious risk to consumers.
What is at stake here is, can the government compel Apple to write software that we believe would make hundreds of millions of customers vulnerable around the world, including the U.S.? The only way we know would be to write a piece of software that we view as sort of the software equivalent of cancer. We think it's bad news to write. We would never write it. We have never written it. And that is what is at stake here.
The confrontation has pitted privacy advocates who do not want to give any ground to government efforts to undermine encryption against law enforcement officials who say that people's lives could be at risk unless the shooter's iPhone is unlocked. The attack on December the 2nd by Farouk and his wife killed 14 people and injured 22 others, and began a political debate in America about the status of Muslims in the country. The couple were killed in a shootout with police. As the debate has grown over the last week, since the initial court order to Apple was handed down, the technology company has come in for praise and criticism from various sides. Speaking out against the company, the Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump has called for people to boycott the company over the issue. Meanwhile, in a number of rallies held outside Apple stores across America, organized by the group Fight for the Future, many activists voiced their support for Apple's decision.
I want my privacy and security to remain as it is, and I support Apple and what they're doing.
Despite this, many opinion polls show that 51% of the American public say that they are generally supportive of the FBI's efforts to gain access to the phone. While President Obama has so far refused to comment on the specific issue, he has recently announced the creation of a cybersecurity commission to recommend upgrades to the current system, which he says is not as organized as it needs to be.
We've made some enormous progress since I came into office, chipping away at the problem, trying to upgrade certain systems, trying to patch over certain security vulnerabilities. But what I've indicated is, even as we are vigilant and constantly trying to improve the security of systems that we currently have, and even as we set up frameworks for cooperation with the private sector where there are particular vulnerabilities, this is going to be a big agenda, a long-term agenda that is extremely complicated, extremely technical, and is going to require us to overhaul a bunch of legacy systems that are already in place.
As things stand, data protection looks set to continue to be a topic of serious debate for many years to come. Nathaniel Amos Sansom, The Report.
Well, joining me on the line to discuss this story is Dr. Darren Hayes, who's a digital and forensics and cybersecurity expert at Pace University, New York. Dr. Hayes, welcome to the programme. Are we seriously supposed to believe that the FBI can't crack this on its own?
Well, with the way that Apple has changed its technology, it makes it virtually impossible for the FBI and other agencies to access these phones. Just under 2 years ago, Apple changed their model of key encryption and basically can no longer facilitate law enforcement investigations. And if they can't do it, then it means that a lot of agencies can't do it either.
So some people, and obviously quite a lot of people in the States, find that a reassuring development, that the government can't break into your phone at will. They're right to be reassured, aren't they, in a way?
I think that there's a lot of misinformation, and I think one of the issues is that this is a law enforcement matter and not an intelligence gathering matter. So people talk about surveillance, and this is definitely not a surveillance question, because there are many other ways that different types of governments would conduct surveillance, and it's definitely not through the method that Apple and the FBI are arguing about. I think that it's important to understand that Apple has always had tremendous encryption and great security. And so if you asked Apple today, 2 years ago, did they have poor security or poor encryption? The answer would be no. But 2 years ago, they were facilitating law enforcement investigations. I think it's also important to understand that the debate over here is about Apple facilitating the investigation and Apple accessing the devices, and not turning over the keys to the kingdom to to the FBI and local law enforcement. That's definitely not the case.
Well, we heard in that clip the spokesman from Apple kind of describing it as if that was what was going to happen. As he said, it's a cancer. It'll spread. In other words, is he wrong?
I think so, because I think the process would still be maintained by Apple. They're not showing the FBI how to do it. They would be in charge of the process. So from a technical perspective, what they would actually do is they would develop their own firmware and sign it. And only Apple could sign this firmware. They're not giving the ability to sign the firmware to the FBI or to another organization. So I think what Apple is really concerned about is the fact that there's been this huge backlog of cases that can't proceed forward because companies have these locked phones. So for example, the Manhattan DA, Cyrus Vance, has said that there's 175 cases that cannot proceed right now because of locked phones. And these are phones from murderers, rapists, child pedophiles, and so forth.
So is it the number of these that Apple would have to unlock if this became a precedent? Is that what you're saying the issue is for them?
I think so. I think because what's going to happen is they are just going to be inundated. Other agencies are going to approach judges and say, well, this has been done once. We want the same results. And so Apple would be inundated with thousands of phones that it hasn't been facilitating for the past year and a half.
So is it sort of a money question for them? They'd have to kind of set up almost a sort of subdivision of Apple for the purposes of the Justice Department or whoever?
Sure. Apple have to maintain a staff that is going to answer these warrant requests. And so they will have to staff this operation.
Is the scale of it? I mean, when you say Cyrus Vance is talking about 175 cases, well, all right. So if Apple had to deal with all of those, I mean, for a corporation the size and profitability of Apple, it's hardly a sort of, you won't be expecting the shares to plummet anytime soon on that news, would you?
No, not at all. But Apple is in the business of making money, and to have people facilitating warrant requests from law enforcement agencies across the country and across the world, there's a cost consideration. And I think that we need to start thinking seriously about congressional legislation, which would also make sure that Apple gets paid for its time in facilitating these types of investigations. Because there is congressional legislation, like an act called the CLIA Act, where telecom companies do get compensated for facilitating law enforcement investigations.
I see. And so you think that if that, if suddenly that became possible, Apple's more, shall we say, philosophical problems would evaporate?
I think it would help. I think this issue that's been mentioned many times by Apple about securing people's privacy and protecting privacy rights is pretty interesting, considering the amount of money that Apple makes from gathering personal information about individuals from their phones. So I think if you asked Apple, are they going to collect less information about your use of a phone, they would probably have to admit that they don't. They thrive on data and selling that data to third parties.
You were saying that, as far as surveillance is concerned, there's many other ways of getting at the kind of information that might be of interest to the authorities other than cracking this, having the access to this iPhone. So what is it that the law enforcement authorities are after in regard of this phone that they couldn't get, say, from the service provider?
What they're looking for is information related to third-party apps. So today, we have this law in America called the Communications Assistance Law Enforcement Act, whereby telecom companies have to support law enforcement during an investigation. You can no longer go to the cell phone provider for the information that you would have relied upon a number of years ago, because a lot of people, particularly younger people, are not using traditional SMS. They're using WhatsApp, they're using Skype, they're using Viber, they're using applications like this. And you do need the phone sometimes to get access to this kind of information. The other problem is that some of these providers are resident in countries beyond the jurisdiction of the US, and so they may not comply with a court order, or they may not be willing to help law enforcement in the US.
So in other words, there are forms of communication of which the record will be on the phone, but which is less easily or perhaps not at all possible to access in the way that your call log would be from IT&T or whoever.
Absolutely. So there will be information perhaps in plain text on the actual device, whereas if you contact the service provider, they may say the information that we have on our service is actually encrypted. You need to go to the device itself to extract that evidence.
Okay. Dr. Darren Hayes, thanks very much for talking us through that minefield.